Hello BookTube, it's Leah Cooper here. Today I'm doing another monthly recommendations. This month's subject is required reading, and there was some suggestion that you could kind of do whatever you want with this theme. I think that's kind of always how monthly recs is. I decided to put myself to a little challenge, and specifically I wanted to do a required reading list if I taught a senior reading seminar in high school. So this is American high school students 17 to 18. What would I put on the required reading list? And I specifically broke it up into 2 semesters, so first semester and second semester. And this is kind of a reaction to the fact that I took it was a senior lit seminar, but it was a senior reading seminar, let's be real, where we exclusively read books and wrote reports and had seminar discussions on them. And I was not a big fan of most of the books we had to read, as well as the teacher for that class was also my American Lit class professor, and I feel like I took another class from her, but maybe not. Irregardless, in high school, I did not care for the books we read, and I think a lot of them were, the stereotypical old, dead, white guy, heterosexual books with a lot of bonus classic Puritanism included. And I think it was a terrible reading list. And so I really wanted to think about what books would I want 17 to 18-year-olds or, end of high school students to read critically, to discuss critically as they are preparing for college. 2 of the books on this list I have not personally read. I only know what the themes of the books are and how well regarded they are in the book community. Both of them are books that I do want to read eventually, and I think thematically they are important or useful or conversation starters, and they fit with some of my other books on this list that I have read that I did want to include, because I tried to kind of like double up, like pick 2 books on a topic that were very different from one another but talked about the same themes, because I think that can lend itself to really good seminar discussions for students. So this list might seem kind of weird, but let's just jump right into it. In first semester, I wanted to start off with an easy book. So I picked The Bone Season by Laura Ruby. So I read this recently. It was very nearly a 5-star read for me, and I think it's great for a lot of different reasons. First of all, I think the neuroatypical protagonist is incredibly well written and not something that I see enough in literature. Also, the writing just in general is extremely beautiful. It deals with themes of complex relationships, family, love, growing up, and personal identity. We've got a neuroatypical character who doesn't realize that there might actually be a reason for why they see the world so differently from everyone else, and realizing that, being confronted with that, the people around him, how they struggle to connect with him. Also, I did not realize this while I was reading it, and it's actually one of the parts of the book that didn't jive with me very well, but apparently this is a very, very, very loose Persephone retelling, and so I don't really see that. I mean, I kind of see it. I can get where they're coming from, but I think that's actually one of the weakest elements in the book, and I don't have a Persephone story, like a classic Persephone story, that I could dovetail with Bone Gap. That was my original thinking, but I did want to dovetail a classic onto it that I think you could draw some parallels to, and that is Much Ado About Nothing. So Much Ado About Nothing is also one of the oldest books on this list, because I picked more contemporary stories for the most part, because I think we have in school with young kids this propensity for requiring them to read very old books that are not always the most engaging or the easiest to read. Not that reading has to be easy in school, but I think there is a danger when you present books that are incredibly dated, that do not resonate with students. I think you have a danger of turning them off reading, and so I wanted to be careful about how many old books I included on this. But I think reading some Shakespeare is good because it's so it's so referenced in, Western American culture. So that some familiarity with it is good. I fucking hate Romeo and Juliet, and I was not going to do that. But I think Much Ado About Nothing is very good. It's also very popular. I think there are some interesting parallels you could draw between Hero that happen in Bone Gap. And I think there's also a good discussion there about relationships, possibly toxic relationships in Much Ado About Nothing, that it's light, it's easy, it's fun, it's got some good discussion topics. I think you could draw some parallels. After that, I really wanted to include another coming of age story, again, to tie back into Bone Gap, but I wanted to pick one that was queer, because I know for certain that we do not teach enough queer lit or non-cis het lit in school. So the third book I would have first semester would be Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. I've not actually read this book, but I know it is well regarded. I know it deals with the coming of age of a young girl who's discovering that she is a lesbian who lives in extremely conservative Protestant upbringing. And so, I suspect that it would be a very informative book for a lot of teens to read. It's also not excessively long. That's the other thing. I wanted to do a mix of, shorter and longer books. And then to finish up that semester, I figured we'd end on a long book. And this is possibly something that, they could read over winter holiday even. And that is Catch-22 by Jonathan Heller. It's been a while since I read Catch-22, but I absolutely loved it when I read it. And I also think it's something of a subversive novel. I mean, it is on the surface just a war novel, but it's darkly humorous, and it brings up really serious themes, but in an extremely readable way. And I don't think it's necessarily something that gets read in schools very often, but I think, especially in America, where we have this sort of unquestioning addiction to wars, I think it's really important to bring in more diverse perspectives on that. And I weighed between Catch-22 and Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, but ultimately I haven't read Slaughterhouse-Five, and I suspect that might be a little bit more difficult to grasp. I think the themes in Catch-22, because of the way they're presented in this darkly humorous way, it makes them a little bit easier to digest and to discuss. And then, like I said, since that's a longer book, you could easily have them read that over winter break, so that when you come back to second semester, you can jump right into my next suggestion for required reading, which is 1984 by Ray Bradbury. It's been a while since I read 1984, but again, man, there are so many books that are suddenly becoming so relevant to our lives again. And I think 1984 dovetails really well with Catch-22, because Catch-22, there is this ongoing questioning of, the war. There's also, it highlights the ridiculousness of the military-industrial complex and the absurdities that it is entangled up in. And in 1984, we're dealing with propaganda, brainwashing. It's not necessarily the military, but it is this martial law that has tightened its grip on society to a terrifying degree. And there are parallels between, the thought police of 1984, the unquestioning patriotism that is tied up in the American military-industrial complex. After that dystopian, the next thing I wanted to move into would be race, because at this point we've covered coming of age, we've slipped into war in society, and now I wanted to really confront racial tensions and racial issues, because again, I came from a very white middle class high school, and this was something that was never addressed. And now obviously that's not the case for all schools, depending on the area and the school district and everything like that, but there's a lot, and I don't think this gets taught. So the next thing I would have them read, and this is what I have not read, is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. So like I said, I haven't read this, but obviously it's an extremely timely topic, themes, subject matter, dealing with issues that high school students are witnessing around them right now that they may have engaged with or encountered. Really well received. So I think I feel pretty safe putting it on this list, even though I haven't read it. So that would be kind of like my introduction, my modern contemporary primer for racial tensions in America. Moving into the next book, which is not a book, well, it's a poetry collection. And that's the other thing, I wanted to do kind of like a mix of different types of books, not only length, but types of books. So we've had a play, we've had a couple of novels, we have had adult novels and YA novels. And so this is a poetry collection, and it's Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. And I suggested this because it's dealing with contemporary 21st century topics of racism and media. Much of the poetry is prose poetry, which means I think it could be a little bit easier for students who might not be very familiar with poetry to digest and engage with. And because it is dealing with media topics, it's something that would be very easy to bring in outside articles and stuff like that for discussion, for supplementary reading. And then tagging on to that, because it's a poetry book, it's shorter, be quicker to read, I wanted to include, oh my god, Goodreads just, my ad blocker was turned off and Goodreads just started auto-playing a video and I literally couldn't close it or mute it. Screw you, Goodreads. Anyways, I wanted to include another poetry collection. This one is not easy. Like, this is like the complete opposite of Citizen when it comes to difficulty level, and I wouldn't suggest having students read it, all of it, more maybe curate parts of it for them to read. But I think it's really important that more people be exposed to this poetry collection, and that is Zong, and I'm gonna butcher her name probably, but by M. Nabursi Philip. This is something I read in college, but I think you could curate sections of it and also provide students with a historical context in itself would be eye-opening, horrifying, and educational. I'm just going to read this little description off of her Phillips's website just because I think it's more concise than what I could say. Zong is an extended poetry cycle based on a legal decision at the end of the 18th century related to the murder of Africans on board a slave ship. And it takes the legal decision, the words of the legal decision, and reconstitutes those words into a book of poetry. And it is horrifying and gut-wrenching and something that I think white people in specific are very isolated from by our institutions, our culture, our denial of the past, and our own complicity in a slave culture and in a racist culture that still persists in many ways today. And so Zong is not an easy text, but it's an extremely enlightening text and worth putting in a little work for. And that way, you can expose students to two very different styles of poetry. And then to wrap up the year, I wanted to do one more book that has to do with race relations. And I think one of the best books recently that I have read that has dealt with the subjugations of populations is The Fifth Season by M.K. Jemisin. Obviously, if I could have students read the whole trilogy, I would, but that is not something that you do in school. But I think just reading the first book, there are so many great themes in that and great topics of discussion. Sometimes it is easier to discuss difficult topics when they are taken out of a modern context. And just in general, I would love to see more people be exposed to that book and read that book. It isn't an easy text to get into, but it's definitely worth digging into. It's good to see themes juxtaposed sometimes against, fantasy cultures so that it can highlight issues in your own culture. So anyways, those are just some of my thoughts on what I would put on a required reading list for a senior reading seminar. It's a little all over the place. Possibly some of these books are considered too adult. I am not someone who has ever taken a class on child education or teen education, but those are just some of my thoughts. Let me know what you think of my selection of books. What kind of books would you put on a senior reading seminar? I'm really curious. Did you enjoy or dislike the books that you were required to read as a teenager? Did they help you or did they hinder you developing good reading habits? I'm really curious. And I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.